Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. Normally, our guests deal with the unexpected, which is anything that doesn't have to do with inclusion or diversity. Today, however, we get to sort of deal with both. We have a guest who actually was a guest on our podcast before. He was in show 19 that goes all the way back to January of 2022. His name is Mike Paciello. He's been very involved in the whole internet and accessibility movement and so on for more than 30 years. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun chatting about what's going on in the world of accessibility and the internet and but we won't probably get into whether God is a man or a woman, but that's okay. God is actually both, so we don't have to worry about that. But anyway, Mike, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Yeah, hey Mike, thanks a lot. I can't believe, has it really been already since 6 years since the last time I came on this
No,
your show?
2022.
Oh, 2022. For whatever I had 2019. Okay, 3 years sounds a little bit more realistic, but
No, but still, it's been a long time.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and obviously, as you know, a lot of things have changed in my life since then. But yeah, very cool.
Well, you were in show number 19, and I'm not sure what number this is going to be, but it's going to be above 360. So It's been a while.
Amazing, unstoppable.
Unstoppable. That's it. We got to keep it going. And Mike and I have been involved in a few things together. I guess it was in 20. When did we do the Enabling Summit? That was 2021, wasn't it? Yeah, I think it was.
I think it was the year before we did the podcast. Yeah, that podcast.
It was 2021.
Right.
So we were in DC, and we both worked because there was a group that wanted to completely condemn the kinds of technologies that Accessibility and other companies use. Some people call it overlays. I'm not sure that that's totally accurate today, but we worked to get them to not do what they originally intended to do, but rather to explore it in a little bit more detail, which I think was a lot more reasonable to do. So we've had some fun over the years, and we see each other every so often, and here we are again today. So
yeah,
I'm glad you're here. Well, tell us a little about. Well, and I guess what we'll do is do some stuff that we did in 2022. Tell us about kind of the early Mike growing up and all that, and what eventually got you into dealing with all this business of web accessibility and such.
Yeah, thank you. I've tried to shorten this story 100 times.
Oh, don't worry.
Let's see if I can keep it succinct. And for the folks out there who understand verbosity at its finest way for screen reader users, I'll try not to be verbose. I already am being verbose.
Intermediate level's fine.
I came into this entire field as a technical writer. Trying to solve a problem that I kind of stumbled into doing some volunteer work for the company that I then worked for, Digital Equipment Corporation, a software company, software hardware company back then, right back in the early 80s. And as a technical writer, I started learning at that time what was called Gen Code. Eventually that morphed into what Charles Goldfarb at IBM called SGML, or Standard Generalized Markup Language. And that really became the predecessor, really gave birth to what we see on the web today, to HTML and the web, markup languages. That's what they were, except back then they were markup languages for print publications. So myself and a lot of colleagues and friends, people probably here, I'm sure, at bare minimum, recognize the name George Kirscher. George and I really paired together, worked together, ended up creating an international standard with a group of other colleagues and friends called the ICAD 22, which is 22 stands for the amount of elements in that markup language. And it became the adopted standard, accessibility standard for the American Association of Publishers. And they published that and became official. Eventually, it morphed into what we today call, accessible web development. It was the first instance that was integrated into the HTML specification. I think officially it was HTML 3.1, 3.2, somewhere in there, when it was formally adopted and then announced in 1997 at the World Wide Web Conference. That's really where my activity in the web began. So I was working at DEC, but I was doing a lot of volunteer work at MIT, which is where the W3C was located at that particular time. And Tim Berners-Lee, who a lot of people I'm sure know, the inventor of the web, led the effort at that time, and a few other folks that I work with, Daniel Dadier, Jim Miller, a few other folks. Um, and we were, well, I wasn't specifically approached. Tim was approached by Vice President Gore and eventually President Clinton at that time to see if we could come up with some sort of technical standard for accessibility. And Tim asked me if I'd like to work on it. Myself, Danielle, Jim, a few others. We did. And we came up with that first initial specification and launched it as part of the Web Accessibility Initiative, which we created in 1997. From there, my career just took off. I went off, did a couple of small companies. Then I launched, my namesake company, the Paciello Group, or TPG, now called TPGI.
TPGI, yeah.
Yeah, which was acquired by Vector Capital or Vispero back in 2017. So it's hard to believe that's already almost 10 years
I
ago.
know.
Yeah, and I've been working in the software, web accessibility field, usability field, writing fields, for some pretty close to 45 years. It's 2025, 40 years. I mean, and I started around 1984, I think it was, 83, 84, when all this first started.
Wow. So clearly you've been doing it for a while and understand a lot of the history of it. So
Yeah.
how overall has the whole concept of web accessibility changed over the years, not only from a coding standpoint, but how do you think it's really changed when it comes to being addressed by the public and companies and so on?
That's a great question. I'd certainly like to be more proactive and more positive about it, but let me be fair. If you compare today and where web accessibility resides, in the business value proposition, so to speak, and list of priorities of companies and corporations, you know, Fortune 1000, Fortune 5000, call whatever you want, accessibility is there. People, you could say Section 508, you could say the Web Accessibility Initiative, WCAG compliance, and by and large, particularly technology driven, digital economy driven businesses, they know what it is. They don't know how to do it. Very rarely do they know how to do it. And even the ones that know how to do it don't really do it very well. So it kind of comes down to the 80-20 rule, right? You're a business, whatever kind of business you are, you're probably in more online presence than ever before. And so a lot of your digital properties would come under, the laws that mandate usability and accessibility for people with disabilities today. That having been said, and more people know about it than ever before. Certainly from the time that I started back in the, again, in the early mid 80s to where we are today, it's night and day. But in terms of prioritization, I don't know. I think what happens quite often is business value propositions get in the way, priorities get in the way of what a business and what its core business are, what they're trying to accomplish, who they're trying to sell to. They still view the disability market, never mind the blind and low vision,
Mm-hmm.
market alone, as a niche market. So they don't make the kind of investments that I believe that they could. There are great companies like Microsoft and Google, Amazon, Apple. A lot of these companies, have done some yeoman work at that level, but it's nowhere near where it should be. It
Yeah.
just absolutely isn't. And so, from that standpoint, and where I envisioned things when I started this career was when I was in my 20 somethings, and now I'm over 60, well over 60. Yeah, I expected a lot more in an internet age, much more.
Yeah. Well, it's really strange that so much has happened and yet so much hasn't happened. And I agree with you. There's been a lot of visibility for the concept of accessibility and inclusion and making the internet a better place. But it is so unfortunate that most people don't know how to do anything with it. Schools aren't really teaching it. And more important than even teaching the coding, from my perspective, looking at it more philosophically, what we don't tend to see are people really recognizing the value of disabilities and the value that the market that people with disabilities bring to the world is significant. I mean, the Center for Disease Control talks about the fact that there are like up to 25% of all Americans have some sort of disability. Now, I take a different approach, actually. I don't know whether you've read my article on it, but I believe everyone in the world has a disability, and the reality is most people are light dependent. But that's as much a disability as blindness, except that since 1878, when Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, we have focused nothing short of trying to do everything we can to improve light on demand for the last 147 years. And so the disability is mostly covered up, but it's still there.
Yeah, and I did read that article, and I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, I personally think, and I actually have my own blog coming out probably later this month, might be early July, where I talk about the fact that accessibility, okay, and technology really has been all along. And I love the fact that you identified the late 1800s there when Edison did the light bulb. Alexander Graham Bell came up with, the telephone. All of those inventions were coming about. But accessibility to people with disabilities, regardless of what their disability is, has always been a catalyst for innovation. That was actually supposed to be the last point I was going to make tonight. Now it's my first point because I think it is exactly as you said, Mike. I think that people are not aware, and when I say people, I mean the entire human population. I don't think that we are aware of the history of how because of, I'm not sure if this is the best word, but accommodating users, accommodating people with disabilities in whatever way, the science that goes behind that, design, architectural, to the point of development and release, oftentimes things that were done on behalf of people with disabilities or for people with disabilities resulted in a fundamental, how's this for an interesting term, a fundamental alteration, right, to any other common, and I apologize for the tech language, user interface, right?
Right.
Anything that we interact with has been enhanced because of accessibility, because of people saying, hey, if we made this grip a little bit larger or stickier, we'll call it, so I can hold on to it, or softer for a person that's got fine motor dexterity disabilities, right? Or if we made a web browser, which of course we have, such that a blind individual, a low vision individual, can adjust the size of the images and the fonts and things like that on a web page. They can do that on their own. Well, these things now, as we well know, help individuals without disabilities.
Well,
I'm
so
not
much.
right, and again, I'm not speaking as a person beyond your characterization that, hey, look, we are all imperfect, we all have disabilities, and that is absolutely true. But beyond that, I wear glasses. That's it. I do have a little hearing loss too, but I'm finding myself more and more, for example, increasing the size of text. In fact, my notes. Yes, I increase them to, I don't know, they're like 18 point, just so that it's easier to see. But that is a common thing for every human being, just like you said.
Well, the reality is that so many tools that we use today came about because of people with disabilities. Peggy Chung, Curtis Chung's wife, is known as the Blind History Lady. And one of the stories that she told on her first visit to Unstoppable Mindset, which, by the way, is episode number 5. I remember that. Peggy tells the story of the invention of the typewriter, which was invented for a blind countess because she wanted to be able to communicate with her lover without her husband knowing about it. and she didn't want to dictate things and so on. She wanted to be able to create a document and seal it, and that way it could be delivered to the lover directly. And the typewriter was the result of that.
I didn't know that. I will definitely go back. I just wrote it down. I wrote down a note. That was episode number 5.
Yeah,
And I've
that
met
was one.
Peggy before, with Curtis a couple of times, quite obviously a good friend of ours.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's awesome.
Well, and look at, I'll tell you one of the things that really surprises me. So Apple was going to get sued because they weren't making any of their products accessible. And before the lawsuit was filed, they came along and they said, "We'll fix it." And they did make, and it all started to a degree with iTunes U, but also it was the iPhone and the iPod and so on. But they did the work mostly. They embedded a screen reader called VoiceOver in all of their operating systems. They did make iTunes U available. What really surprises me, though, is that I don't tend to see perhaps some things that they could do to make VoiceOver more attractive to drivers so they don't have to look at the screen when a phone call comes in or whatever. And that they could be doing some things with VoiceOver to make it more usable for sighted people in a lot of instances. And I don't see any emphasis on that, which is really surprising to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there are a lot of use cases there that you could go for. I think Mark Riccobono would certainly agree with you in terms of autonomous driving for the blind, right?
Sure, that too.
But I definitely agree, and I know the guy that the architect VoiceOver and developed VoiceOver for Apple, and boy, why can't I think of his last? I know his first name is Mike. Is with Be My Eyes now,
Yeah,
and doing things at that level. But I will just say one thing, not to correct you, but Apple had been in the accessibility business long before VoiceOver. Alan Brightman and Gary Moulton
sure.
were instrumental towards convincing Jobs of the importance of accessibility to people with disabilities.
Right. But they weren't doing anything to make products accessible for blind people who needed screen readers until that lawsuit came
That
along.
was before screen readers. Yeah, that was before.
But
Their
they did
their
it.
problem
But
was
they did
before
it.
screen readers. Yeah,
The only
right.
thing I wish Apple would do in that regard that they haven't done yet is Apple has mandates and requirements if you're going to put an app in the App Store. And I don't know whether it's quite still true, but it used to be that if your app had a desktop or it looked like a Windows desktop, they wouldn't accept it in the App Store. And one of the things that surprises me is that they don't require that app developers make sure that their products are usable with VoiceOver. And the reality is that it doesn't need to be a really significantly moving target. For example, let's say you have an app that is dealing with displaying star charts or maps.
Right.
I can't see the map. I understand that. But at least VoiceOver ought to give me the ability to control what goes on the screen so that I can have somebody describe it and I don't have to spend 15 or 20 minutes describing my thought process, but rather I can just move things around on the screen to get to where we need to go. And I wish Apple would do a little bit more in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's a great thought, and a great challenge. If between me and you, I think it goes back to what I said before. Even though we both see how accessibility or accommodating users with disabilities has led to some of the most incredible innovations. I mean, the Department of Defense for years would integrate people with disabilities in their user testing
Mm-hmm.
so that they could better help, military soldiers and things like that, assimilate situations where there was no hearing, they were immobile, they couldn't see, all of these things that were natural, user environments or personas for people with disabilities. So they've led to these kind of, incredible innovations. I would tell you, Mike, and I think you know this, it's because the business value proposition dictates otherwise.
Yeah. And well, I guess I would change that slightly and say that people think that the business proposition does, but it may very well be that they would find that there's a lot more value in doing it if they would really open up their minds to looking at it differently.
It's kind of yeah, it's kind of like if
It's
I could
tough.
use if it's kind of like if I could use this illustration, so to speak, for those who may not be religiously inclined, but it's like prophecy. Most people, you don't know whether or not prophecy is valid until years beyond, years after, and then you could look back at time and say, "See, it was
Yeah.
all along these things, resulted in a major paradigm shift in the way that we do or don't do things. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. If people would really look at the potential of what technologies like, a voiceover, or as a good friend of mine said, look, it should be screen readers. It should be voice IO interfaces, right?
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
every human can use and
Right.
interact with regardless. That's what we're really talking about.
There's a big discussion going on some of the lists now about the Meta Ray-Ban glasses and some of the
Hmm.
things that it doesn't do or that they don't do well that they should. Like it's really difficult to get the Meta glasses to read completely a full page. I think there are ways that people have now found to get it to do that, but there are things like that don't happen. And again, I think it gets back to what you're saying is the attitude is, well, most people aren't going to need that. Well,
Hmm.
the reality is, how do you know? And how do you know what they'll need until you offer options? So, one of my favorite stories is when I worked for Kurzweil a long time ago. Some people called one day and they wanted to come and see a new talking computer terminal that Ray and I and others developed.
Hmm.
And they came up, and it turns out they were with one of those initial organizations out of Langley, Virginia, the CIA. And what
Hmm.
they wanted to do was to use the terminal connected to their computers to allow them to move pointers on a map and not have to watch the map or the all of the map while they were doing it, but rather the computer would verbalize where the pointer was, and then they could move it around and pin a spot without having to actually look at the screen because the way their machine was designed, it was difficult to do that. The reality is that most of the technologies that we need and that we use and can use could be used by so many more people if people would just really look at it and think about it. But you're right, they don't.
It's of course Ray's another good friend of mine. We both have in common. I work with
Yeah,
him. I been down to his office more than a few times. Although his Boston office anyway. I'm not sure he's in Newton.
he's in Newton. Yeah,
Is he still in Newton? Okay.
yeah.
But anyway, it reminded me of something that happened in a similar vein, and that was several years ago. I was at a fast forward forward conference, future forward conference, and a company EMC who
Mm,
got absorbed by Dell, I think, right? I think that's
yes,
where they all are. So
I
they're
was surprised that when that happened, but hey,
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Of
they
course, I
were.
was surprised that Compaq bought Dep, so that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, right. Then HP bought, right? That
Yeah.
whole thing happened. But their chief scientist, I think he was their CSO, chief scientist, came up and made this presentation. And basically, the presentation was using voice recognition. They had been hired by the NSA, so
Mm,
it's CIA, NSA, right? To use voice recognition in a way where they would recognize voices and then record those voices into output the transcript of that into
right.
text files and then feed them back to the NSA agents, right? So here's the funny part of that story goes. I I waited. He gave his presentation. This is amazing technology, and it was like 99% accurate in terms of not just recognizing, American English speaking people, but a number of different
Right.
other languages and dialects. And the guy who gave the presentation, I actually knew because he had been at DEC for many years. So in the Q&A part, I raised my hand. I got up there. He didn't recognize me. A few years had gone by. And I said, this is amazing technology. We could really use this in the field that I work in. And he said, well, how's that? And I said, voice recognition and outputting text would allow us to do. Now, this is probably 2008, 2009, somewhere in that area,
Right.
would allow us to do real time automated transcription for the deaf,
Mm-hmm.
captioning.
Mm-hmm.
And he looks at me and he says, "Do I know you?" This is through a live audience. I don't know, five, six
Yeah.
hundred people in the audience. And I said, "Yeah, Mark." His name was Mark. He said, "It's Mike Paciello." He said, "You're the only guy in town that I know that could turn a advanced emerging technology into something for people with disabilities." I can't believe it. So that was weird. But there was kind of the opposite. It was a technology that they were focused on making this this technology available for, government, obviously, covert reasons, that if they were using it and applying it in a good way for people with disabilities, man, we'd have been much faster, much further along than
Mm-hmm.
where we are even today, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
today it's being done. Still not as good, not as good as that as I saw, but that just goes to show you what commercial and government funding can do when it's applied properly.
Well, Dragon, naturally speaking, has certainly come a long way since the original Dragon Dictate, but there's still errors.
Sure.
There's still things.
Yep.
But it does get better. But I hear exactly what you're saying. And the reality is that we don't tend to think in broad enough strokes for a lot of the things that we do, which is so unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, I've had an old saying that I've walked around for a long time. I should make a baseball cap with it or something or a T-shirt, and it simply was think accessibility.
Yeah.
Period. If we organizations, people, designers, developers, architects, usability people, QA people, if everybody in the development life cycle was thinking about accessibility, or accessibility was integrated. And when we say accessibility, we're talking about, again, for users with disabilities, if that became part of, if not the functional catalyst for technology, man, we'd have been a lot further along in the quote unquote value chain than we are today.
One of the big things, at least, that Apple did do was they built VoiceOver into their operating system. So anybody who buys any Apple device today automatically has redundancy here, but access to accessibility,
Right.
which is really the way it ought to be. No offense to Vispero and Jaws, because they're able to fill the gap, but still, if Microsoft had truly devoted the time that they should have to narrator at the beginning, we might see a different kind of an architecture today.
I want to. By the way, the person that invented that wrote that code is Mike Shabanik. That's his name. I was
Yeah.
thinking about. So, Mike, if you're listening to this, just hi from two other mics.
And if
Yes.
he's not, he should be.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, right. From two other mics. But so let me ask you this question, because I legitimately can't remember this, and have had a number of discussions with Mike about this. So VoiceOver is native to
Right.
the US, right? But
No,
does
well, no, to the iProducts, but not just the US.
no. I said OS, operating
OS.
system.
So yes, it's
OS.
native to OS.
OS, yeah, right. It's native that way, right?
Yeah.
But doesn't it still use an off-screen model for producing or translate the transformation of on screen to voice?
Um, I'm not sure that's totally true. Go a little bit deeper into that for me.
Well, I mean, so NVDA and JAWS use this off-screen model, right? Which is functionally they
Yeah.
grab some content of whatever it is, push it
Yes. Yes.
to this, we'll call it a little black box,
Right.
do all its translations, do all the transformation, and then push it back so it's renderable to a screen reader.
Right.
Okay. So that's this off-screen model that is transparent to the users, although now you can get into it and tweak it and work with it, right?
Right.
And I recall when Mike was working on the original design of voiceover, and he had called me and I said, "Are you going to continue with the notion of an off-screen model?" And he said, "Yeah, we are." And I said, "Well, when you can build something that's more like what TV Ramen has,
Hmm.
built into Emacs, and it works integral to the actual OS, purely native, call me because then I'm interested in it." But now that was, 15, 20 years ago, right? I mean, how long has voiceover been around?
Since 2007,
Right. So, yeah, 20 years ago, right? Just shy of 20 years.
18 years, right?
Um, um, so I don't know. I honestly don't know.
I'm not totally sure, but I believe that it is. But I can, we'll have to
You have
look
to,
into that.
and if anyone in the audience is out there looking and you get to us before we find out, let us
Well,
know.
we'll
But
find out at
that's
the
important.
NFB convention because there are going to be a number of Apple people there. We can certainly ask
There you
that.
go. That's right. For sure. James Craig is bound to be there. I can ask him and talk to him about that for sure. Yep. So
But I,
anyway,
but I think it's a valid point. And the issue is that again, if done right, and app developers are doing things right, there there ought to be a way that every app has some level of accessibility that makes it more available. And the reality is, people other than blind people use some of these technologies as well. So we're talking about voice input. Quadriplegics, for example, who can't operate a keyboard will use, or a mouse can use like a puff and sip stick to,
right.
and Dragon to interact with a computer and are successful at doing it. The reality is there's a whole lot more opportunities out there than people think.
Don't I agree with that? I'm shaking my head up and down, Mike, and I'm telling you, there is, I mean, voice recognition alone. I can remember having a conversation with Tony Vitale, who's one of the co-inventors of the Deck Talk, and that goes all the way back into the early '90s about voice recognition and linguistics and what it
Hmm.
would take to, and I know Kurzweil did a lot of work in this area, right, on voice utterances and things like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a wide open window of opportunity there for study and research that could easily be improved. And as you said, and this is the point, it doesn't just improve the lives of the blind or low vision, it improves the lives of a number of different types of disability persona types, but it would certainly create a pathway, a very wide path for individuals, users without disabilities in a number of different life scenarios.
Yeah, and it's amazing how little sometimes that's done. I had the pleasure a few years ago of driving a Tesla down Interstate 15 out here in California.
Glad I wasn't there.
You bigot. You know the co-pilot system worked,
Yeah,
and I just kept my hands on the wheel, so I didn't do
right,
much. We
right.
did not have any accidents. Back off now.
Okay, okay.
It worked out really well. But here's what's really interesting in that same vehicle, and it's something that I find all too often is the case. If I were a passenger sitting in the front seat, there's so much that I, as a passenger, don't have access to that other passengers do.
Hmm.
Radios now are mostly touchscreen, which
Right,
means
that's right.
and they don't build in the features that would make the touchscreen system, which they could do,
Hmm.
accessible.
Yep.
The Tesla vehicle is incredibly inaccessible, and there's for a guy who's so innovative, there's no reason for that to be that way. And again, I submit that if they truly make the product so a blind person could use it, think of how much more a sighted person who doesn't have to take their eyes off the road could use the same technologies.
Mike, again, you and I are on the same page. I mean, imagine these guys are supposed to be creative and imaginative and forward thinking, right? Can you imagine a better tagline than something along the lines of Tesla so user friendly that a blind person can drive it?
Yeah.
I mean, this is, have you
Yeah.
ever? heard or seen, metaphorically speaking, or
That's okay.
an advertisement or PR done by any company, because they're all the way across the board, that hasn't featured what it can do to enhance the lives of people with disabilities, where it wasn't a hit. I mean, literally, it was.
Yeah.
You see these commercials played over and over to Apple, Microsoft, Amazon. I see McDonald's, Walmart. I mean, I could just name them one after another. Really, really outstanding. Salesforce has done it. It's just incredible.
They would
Bank.
do it.
Yeah. I mean, is there any more human centric message than saying, look what we've built and designed. We're
Right.
releasing to the masses.
To
And by the
everyone.
way, anyone, regardless of ability, can use it.
Yeah.
That to me, that's
I agree.
that's the coup de grace, right, for marketing and PR. Couldn't be
Yeah.
better.
Yeah. And yet they don't.
Right,
I see commercials like about one of the eye injections or whatever, Bobismo or whatever it is, and at the beginning, the woman says, "I think I'm losing sight of the world around me." That's all about
right.
it's eyesight and nothing else. And I appreciate. I'm all for people keeping their eyesight and doing what's necessary, but unfortunately, all too often, we do that at the detriment of other people, which is so unfortunate.
Yeah. Again, not to get off the subject, but one of my favorite books is Rethinking Competitive Advantage by Ram Charan. I don't know if you know him, but the guy is one of my heroes in terms of just vision and business and technology. And in this book, he wrote this a couple of years ago. He said this was his first rule of competition in the digital age. The number one rule was simply this: a personalized consumer experience
Mm-hmm.
is key to exponential growth. And that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you and I are talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Personal, I want to see interfaces adapt to users rather than what we have today, which is users having to adapt to the interface.
Yeah. And it would make so much sense to do. So I hope somebody out there is listening and will maybe take some of this to heart, because if they do it right, they can have a huge market in no time at all just because they show they care.
Yeah.
Nielsen Company did a survey back in 2016 where they looked at a variety of companies and consumers and so on. And if I recall the numbers right, they decided that people with disabilities are 35% more likely to continue to work with and shop, for example, at companies that really do what they can to make their websites and access to their products accessible, as opposed to not.
Yeah.
And that's telling. It's so very telling, but we don't see people talking about that nearly like we should.
You talk about a business value proposition. There is bold proof that where you are leaving money on the table.
Yep, and a lot of it.
Yeah, exactly. We're not talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands. We're talking about billions and trillions
Yeah,
in some instances. Yep,
yeah.
and that's not an exaggeration by any stretch of the imagination. Very, very simple math. I had this conversation a couple years ago with the CEO of Pearson at that time. He's
Mm,
since retired, but I told him, if you spent $1 for every person that it was in the world with a disability, you're talking about one fourth of the population.
right.
It's simple math. Simple math.
But people still won't do it. I mean, you mentioned Section 508 before with the whole issue of web access. How much of the government has really made their websites accessible, even though it's the law?
Yeah, 3 or 4 years ago, they did a study and they found out that every federal agency, most of the federal agencies, were not even keeping
I
up
think it
with the
was,
reporting of the
yeah,
status of where they were, and
yeah.
yet that was written right into the five-way law. They were mandated to do it, and they still didn't do it.
We haven't, the whole Americans with Disabilities Act. Finally, the Department of Justice said that the internet is a place of business, but still, it's not written in the law. And of course, we only see about 3% of all websites that tend to have any level of access. And there's no reason for that. It's not that magical. And again, I go back to what do we do to get schools and those who teach people how to code to understand the value of putting in accessibility right from the outset?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think this is what Kate Sonka is trying to do with Teach Access. In fact, again, my company TPG was one of the founding companies of Teach Access back again 10 years ago when it first
Mm-hmm.
started. But that's where it starts. I mean, they're pretty much focused on post-secondary university education. But I could tell you on a personal level, I was speaking at my kids' grade school, elementary school, because they were already using laptops
Mm-hmm.
and personal computers back then. It starts then. You've got to build a mindset. You've got to
Mm-hmm.
build it. You've heard about the accessibility maturity models coming out of the W3C and IAAP. What that speaks to fundamentally is building a culture within your corporate organization that is think accessibility has a think accessibility mindset, that it is woven into the fiber of every business line and every technology software development lifecycle, all of the contributors at that level from A to Z. But if you don't build it into the culture,
Yeah.
it's not going to happen. So I would love to see a lot more being done at that level. Um, but yeah, it's a hero, yeah,
We're
heroic. Can I
we're
say it?
left out of the conversation so
Yeah,
much.
yeah, totally,
So
totally.
you sold TPG and you then formed or you had WebABLE and then Able Docs.
So what WebABLE came out was a carve out, one of two carve outs that I had from when I sold TPG. The other was Open Access Technologies,
Mm-hmm.
which eventually was sold to another accessibility company, primarily focused on making documentation accessible to meet the WCAG and other standards requirements. And WebABLE, I carved out. It's been a kind of a hobby of mine now for since I sold TPG. I'm still working on the back end. Ironically, from the get-go, so we're talking, again, 8 years ago, I had built machine learning and AI into it from then. Back then, I did. So that what it does is it very simply goes out and collects thousands and thousands of articles as it relates to technology and people with disabilities, and then cleans them up and posts them to webable.com. I've got a
Mm.
lot more planned for it, but that's in a nutshell. That's what it does. And I don't. We do some QA review to make sure that the cleanup in terms of accessibility and the articles are properly formatted and are accessible. We use the WebAIM API. But yeah, works like magic, works like clockwork, and that's got AI, uses IBM Watson AI built into it.
Yeah.
And Able Docs was how should I say this in a nice way? Able Docs was a slight uh, excursion off of my main route. It didn't
Okay.
work out. I wish it had. It had a lot of potential, much like open access
Mm-hmm.
technologies. But they both suffered from owners who really, not including myself, who just didn't have good vision and lacked humility.
Yeah.
How's that?
There you go. Well, so not to go political or anything, but AI in
Hmm.
general is
Yeah.
interesting, and I know that there have been a lot of debates over the last few years about artificial intelligence helping to make websites accessible. There are several companies like AudioEye, UserWay, Accessibility, and so on that, to one degree or another, use AI.
Hmm.
What? So, in general, what do you think about AI and how it's going to help deal with or not the whole issue of disabilities and web access?
Yeah. And we're going to set aside Neil Jacobs' thoughts on how he sees it in the future, right? Although I have to tell you, he gave me some things to think about, so we'll just set that to the side. So I think what AI offers today is something that I thought right away when I started to see the accessibilities, the user ways, the audio eyes, and all the other
Mm-hmm.
companies kind of delving into it. Um, I always saw potential to, how's this, remediate a
Hmm.
fundamental problem or challenge. Let's not call it a problem, a challenge that we were otherwise seeing in the professional services side of that equation around
Hmm.
web accessibility, right? So you get experts who use validation tools and other tools who know about code can go in and they know and they use usability, they use user testing, and they go in and they can tell you what you need to do to make your digital properties, right, usable and accessible to people with disabilities. All well and good. That's great. And believe me, I had some of the best people, if not the best people in the world, work for me at one time. However, there are a couple of things it could not do, and it's never going to do. Number one, first and foremost, from my perspective, it can't scale. It cannot scale. You can do some things at, in a large way. For example, if a company is using some sort of CMS, content management system, in which their entire sites, all their sites, all their digital properties, are woven into templates, and those templates are remediated. So that cuts down a little bit on the work. But if you go into companies now, it's not like they're limited to two or three templates. Now they've got,
Hmm.
department upon department upon department. Everybody's got a different template. So even those are becoming very verbose, and very plentiful. So accessibility as a manual effort doesn't really scale well.
No.
And if it does, even if it could, it's not fast enough.
Right.
So that's what AI does. AI, coupled with automation, speeds up that process and delivers a much wider enterprise level solution. Now, again, AI, automation is not is not a holistic
Hmm.
science. It's not a silver bullet. David Marotti likes to use the term. What is he likes to call the gold standard. Well, from his perspective, and by the way, David Marotti is CEO of AudioEye, is a combination of automation, AI, and expert analysis, along with the use of the integration of user testing. And by user testing, it's not just personas, but it's also compatibility with the assistive technologies that people with disabilities use. Now, when you do that, you've got something that you can pattern after a standard software development lifecycle environment in which you integrate all of these things. So if you got a
Hmm.
validation tool, you integrate it there. If you've got, a digital accessibility platform which does all this automation AI, right? Which again, this is a Forrester's take on the DApps as they calls it. I'm not really crazy about that, but that's what they are. Digital accessibility platforms. It allows us to scale at costs that are much lower,
Hmm.
at speeds that are much faster. And it's just a matter of, like any QA, you've got to check your work, and you can't count on that automation being absolute. We know for a fact that right now, at best, we're going to be able to get 35 to 40% accuracy. Some claim larger in different areas. I'm still not convinced of that. But the fact of the matter is like anything else, technology gets better as it goes, and
Hmm.
we will see improvements over time. Period.
So here's my thought.
Yeah.
Let's say you use AI in one of the products that's out there, and you go to a website and you include it, and it reasonably well makes the website 50% more usable and accessible than it was before.
Hmm.
I just threw out that number.
Yeah.
So
Yep. I know it's random. Go ahead. Yep.
yeah, but let's say it does that. The reality is that means that it's 50% that the web developers, the web coders, don't have to do because something else is dealing with it.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, their mentality is not to want to deal with that because they also fear it. But I remember back in the mid 1980s, I started a company because I went off and tried to find a job and
Hmm.
couldn't find one. So I started a company with a couple of other people where we sold early PC based CAD systems to architects.
Right.
And we had AutoCAD, VersaCAD, and
Hmm.
another one called Pointline, which was a three-dimensional system using a YCAP solid modeling board that took up two slots in your PC. So it didn't work with all PCs because we didn't have enough slots. But anyway,
Right, right, right.
when I brought architects in and we talked about what it did and we showed them, many of them said, I'll never use that. And I said, why? Well, it does work, and that's not the question. But the issue is we charge by the time. And so we take months to sometimes create designs and projects.
Right.
And so we can't lose that revenue. I said, you're looking at it all wrong. Think about it this way. Somebody gives you a job, you come back and you put it in the CAD system, you go through all the iterations. It takes, let's just say, 2 weeks. Then
Hmm.
you call your customer in, you use Pointline, and you can do a three-dimensional walkthrough and fly through. You can even let them look out the window and see what there is and all that. They want to make changes. They tell you the changes. You go off and you make the changes. And 2 weeks later, now it's a month, you give them their finished product, all the designs, all the plots, and all that, all done. And you charge them exactly the same price you were going to charge them before. Now you're not charging for your time, you're charging for your expertise.
Right.
And I think that same model still holds true, that the technology, I think most people will agree that it is not perfect, but there are a lot of things that it can do, because the reality is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are all things that can be defined with computer code. Whether it necessarily does it all well with AI or not is another story. But if it
Hmm.
does it to a decent fraction, it makes all the difference in terms of what you're able to do and how quickly you can do it.
Yeah, I can't argue with that at all. I think anytime that we can make our jobs a little bit easier so that we can focus where we should be focused, in this case, as you said, the expertise side of it, right, to fix those complicated scenarios or situations that require hands-on surgical like, right? Expertise, you can do that. Now you've got more hours, more time because it's been saved. The
Yeah.
only thing I would say, Mike, about what you just said is that there with that mindset, okay,
Hmm.
comes responsibility.
Oh, yeah.
And this is where I think in everybody that knows anything about this environment, you and I have an intimate understanding of this. The whole overlay discussion is the biggest problem with what happened was less about the technology and more about what claims were being made that
Yeah.
the technology could do, which it
Right.
could not do. In in some cases, could never do, or would
Hmm.
never do, or
Hmm.
would never do well, right? So if you create, and I would submit this is true in as a fundamental principle, if you create a technology of any kind, you must, in truth, inform your clients of what it can and cannot do so that
Right.
they understand the absolute value to them. Because the last thing you want, because again, we live in unfortunately, a very litigious world, right? As soon as there's a mistake or a
Nah,
hole,
couldn't
right?
happen.
They'll go right after you. So
Yeah.
now, and again, I don't, I'm not necessarily just blaming the ambulance chasers of the world. I was talking to an NFP lawyer today. He referred to them in a different name, and I can't remember what I never heard the expression before, but that's what he meant, right?
Yeah.
It's the salesmen and the product managers and the marketing people themselves who were not themselves, to your point, properly trained, properly educated.
Right.
What can and can't be done, what could and could not be said, what should or should not be said, right? And then you got lawyers writing things all over the place. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I look, people knew when I made the decision to come to AudioEye that it was a make or break scenario for me, or at least that's what they thought. And my mindset always has always been that I see incredible possibilities, as you do,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
for technology. It just has to be handled responsibly.
Do you think that the companies are getting better and smarter about what they portray about their products than they were 3 and 4 and 5 years ago?
Okay, look, I sat in and chaired a meeting with the NFB on this whole thing, and without a doubt, they're getting smarter. But it took not just a stick, but these large lawsuits to get them to change their
Yeah,
thinking to see,
yeah.
where they were wrong. And yeah, things are much better. There's still some issues out there. I think
Mm-hmm.
you and I both know it. That's going to happen. That happens in every industry.
But there are improvements. It is getting better, and people are getting
Definitely
smarter.
better,
And
without a
that's
doubt.
where an organization like the NFB really does need to become more involved than in the sense they are. They took some pretty drastic steps with some of the companies, and I think that they cut off their nose despite their face as well, and that didn't help. So I think there are things that need to be done all the way around. But I do see that progress is being made too.
I totally agree. And in fact, I'm working with them right now. We're going to start working on the California Accessibility Act again.
Yeah,
And I'm really looking forward to working with the NFB, the DRC, Andy Imparato over there and his team in the Disability Rights consortium with Disability Rights, what? DRC. Disability
coalition.
Rights Coalition in California.
Yeah.
I can't wait to do that. We tried last year. We got stopped short. It got tabled, but I feel very good about where we're going this year. So that is my focus right now, and I'm glad I'm going to be able to work with the NFB to be able to do that.
Yeah, well, I really do hope that it passes. We've seen some states pass some good legislation, and
Mm.
hopefully we will continue to see some of that go on.
Yeah, Colorado's done a great job there.
Colorado's done a great job.
Yeah, I think they've done it. And I really like what's being done with the EAA, even though it's in Europe and some
Yep.
of the things that are going there. Susanna Lauren and I had some great discussions. I think has been a leader of a yeoman effort at that level. So we'll see. I mean, there's still time out here. I guess I really would like to retire, but
I know the feeling well. But I can't afford to yet, so I'll just keep speaking and all that. Well, Mike, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate you taking an hour and coming on. And at least neither of us is putting up with any kind of snow right now. But later in the
yeah.
year, we'll see more of that.
Yeah, well, maybe you will. We don't get snow down. We've got maybe 25 flakes in North Carolina since I've been here. I
Yeah, you
love it.
don't get a lot of snow. We
Not
don't
anymore.
here. We don't really get it here. Around us up in the mountains, the ski resorts get it, but I'm out in a valley, so we don't.
Yeah, yeah. No,
So
I love it. I love this is golfing weather.
there
That's
you
a
go.
out for me,
Well,
man.
if people want to reach out to you, how do they do that?
There's a couple of ways. Certainly, you can get in touch with me at AudioEye. It's michael.paciello at audioeye.com. You can,
Paciello.
that's correct. Thank you for that. You can send me personal email at mikepaciello at gmail.com. Or you can send me email at WebABLE. It's mpaciello at webable.com. Any one of those ways. And please feel free. I'm on all the social networks, so feel free to connect to me. Anyway, I try to respond. I don't think there's anyone I've not responded to in one form or another.
Yeah, I'm the same way. If I get an email, I want to respond to it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for being here, and I want to thank all of you for listening. We really appreciate it. Love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Please feel free to email me. You can get me the email address I generally use is michaelhi at accessibe.com. Or you can go to our podcast page, which is michaelhingson.com/podcast, and there's a contact form there. But love to hear from you, love to hear your thoughts. And most of all, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening. We value your ratings and your reviews a whole lot. So we really appreciate you doing that. And if any of you, and Mike including you, can think of other people that you think ought to be guests on the podcast, we are always looking for more people. So fill us up, help us find more folks, and we would appreciate that a great deal. So again, Mike, thanks very much. This has been a lot of fun, and we'll have to do it again.
Thanks for the invitation, Mike. I really appreciate it. And don't forget to add Ken Nakata to your list.
Right. Absolutely.